Hello, my name is Lucille Spahn, and the topic that I chose for this presentation is disaster and tourism. So the focus will be on what tourism destinations can do to prepare for and minimize the effects of a disaster. The presentation is broken down into four main sections. The first section is why is it important to have a disaster plan? The second section is what steps a tourism area must take to prepare for a disaster. The third are what are the additional considerations that must be taken when dealing with tourists. And the fourth is how you welcome tourists back after a disaster strikes. So jumping right into the first question, why is it important to have a disaster plan? For one, tourism heavy areas often rely on tourism to boost the economy. In Florida, tourism is the #1 industry. You probably have heard Governor Rick Scott say every 85 visitors equal one job to the state, so definitely an impact there. Also, another reason that tourism should have disaster plans is that they're often at greater risks for disasters. So, for example, let's take Florida again. There's 825 miles of beaches. With beaches comes water and oceans, and with that can come hurricanes and tropical storms. So those heightened risks can bring disasters. So now that you have an understanding of why we need a disaster plan, I'm going to explain some of the steps that can be taken to prepare for a disaster. And many of these are similar to the information that we learned through the FEMA courses that we took and the chapter readings. The first step would be to identify hazards and risks. So in Florida, it would be things like hurricanes, tropical storms, oil spills, public policy issues, terrorism threats, those kinds of things. Then after you ID the risks, you'd want to assess community vulnerability. So for example, here in Florida, places by the water would be at greater risk for natural disasters. So you'd want to make sure that those areas there was a plan in place to protect them. So the next step would be to develop a plan. Convention and visitors bureaus and destination marketing organizations can work with local and state government to put a plan in place that would lay out who's in charge, who's responsible for what, just making sure that everything is in order for the actual implementation of the plan when disaster strikes. And then you'd want to make sure to monitor, evaluate, and revise the plan as needed. So in tourism heavy areas, there are a few additional considerations to be aware of besides the normal steps that you would take. For one, tourists are more vulnerable due to their unfamiliarity with the area, so they may not speak the language, or they may not know what the risks are, or they may have gone off the grid, so to speak, and they're not checking email or listening to the news or watching the weather, so they might not be aware that a disaster is coming. So individual attractions, it's important because of that for them to have emergency plans, and they should convey that information to the people at their resort or at their destination to make sure that it's clear and that everyone knows. But also it's important for those resorts to have in their plan to train employees immediately, because in the service industry there's typically a higher turnover. And so it's important that as soon as that employee starts, they are equipped with the knowledge that they need to handle themselves on behalf of the company should a disaster strike. And another consideration that needs to be taken is who the chief agency is that's in charge, who's the main point person. So in the state of Florida, it is Visit Florida. They would be the ones to relay information to the tourists using channels, pushing out information, working with hotels, all of that kind of stuff to make sure that tourists aren't having to go to multiple areas or to multiple resources to get the information that they need should a disaster strike. The final component of this presentation is how to welcome tourists back after a disaster strikes. So there's a couple of ways to achieve this. First, you'd want to rebuild any damaged infrastructure to make sure everything is up to par for when tourists do start coming back. You'd want to organize fam trips, which bring in the media. You give the media a tour of the area so they can see firsthand that the damage is no longer there, and then they can relay that to their readers or their viewership, their audiences. And One example, personal example of this is when the Gulf Coast oil spill happened. We put up, Visit Florida worked with the local Convention and Visitors Bureaus to put up beach cameras so that people could actually log on and see for themselves firsthand that not all of the beaches were damaged, that many beaches were open to the public and still a great vacation spot. So in conclusion, there are many factors that come into play when dealing with disasters in tourism. There can be language barriers, there can be location issues, just because there are going to be higher risks in many tourism areas. But when destinations have a clear plan of action and they follow that, then routine activities can return to normal quickly and tourism can rebound. So thanks so much for watching. I hope you found this little presentation on disaster and tourism useful.